last time we had met, which was before the Chagim, we went through this, to me at least, an unbelievable transformation of a classic story in Tanakh. And we saw how the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, takes the story and just gives a whole new life to it and just applies it to ourselves and makes it very, very realistic. So I think I mentioned to you then that he actually there are two different versions or there are two different times that he spoke about the same idea. And just to review the first idea, the story, of course, as you have in your PDF, or you should have at least, is that a woman cries out to Elisha. She says, my husband is dead and a creditor is coming to seize my children. And Elisha says, tell me, what do you have in the house? She says, I've got nothing but a jug of oil. And she says, go and borrow. Elisha tells the woman, go and borrow vessels from the outside, empty vessels. Don't limit yourself. And then fill them all up and you'll be able to live from it all. And of course, the miracle happened that she was able to continuously refill the jugs. So the Alter Rebbe explained that the woman is the soul. And the soul is saying that I used to be able to have love and fear of God before I came down into a body, but now that inspiration is completely gone. I don't have any that energy whatsoever. My experience, my emotional and passionate experience of Judaism, of God, is gone. And so the Alter Rebbe explained that you need to have empty vessels. Don't limit your empty vessels. In other words, go fill your vessels, do your Torah and mitzvot, and they will fill, and before you know it, they're going to be totally full, and you'll be full of inspiration again. You'll be able to live from that. So that was one way of looking at this whole thing, and now we're going to see a second time where he explains the same idea, but he breaks it open a little bit further. That first concept of Kelim Reikim is focusing on the empty vessels as they are Torah and mitzvot. This time we're going to focus on making oneself into, so to speak, an empty vessel capable of receiving from God. And this was actually so we have in the actual text of the Alter Rebbe is written down by one of the students of the Alter Rebbe. But our Rebbe taught this mimer as well, taught this essay or this discourse. And instead of quoting from the Alter Rebbe, we're going to quote it from the Rebbe himself and see how the Rebbe paraphrased the Alter Rebbe's explanation, because there are some details in there or explanations, slight nuances that the Rebbe brings in, which I think are very, very important, very beautiful. And then afterwards, the Rebbe breaks it open further and explains it in a very beautiful way. So this is going back to 1985. And this is actually, I was able to listen to it on a recording, not just to see it in paper. It's always nice to be able to have it kind of in a live sense. So again, the introductory verses, if you hadn't seen them, you can see them on chapter 1. But now we're going to move over to chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe's second explanation. So in the first paragraph, the Rebbe just introduces the whole idea. And he says the background to the story, which we read in the Haftarah of this week, that was the week of that he was speaking, is that this is one of the major miracles that the prophet Elisha performed as a direct result of his request of his teacher Eliyahu to have twice his capabilities. So Elijah, the prophet, of course, is going up to heaven, and he says to Elisha, you're going to take over for me, and what blessings can I give for you? So Elisha says, I need twice your capabilities, kiflaim l'toshia, as they say, and Elijah gives him that blessing, and then the storyline continues and shows that several of the things that had happened with Eliyahu happened in a much more massive way, or twice as many miracles, actually, in terms of actual numbers, these major miracles. That's what we see when you're reading the text. But considering that even the stories that are recorded in the Torah are meant to serve as a lesson to us, there must be a directive that we can take and apply to our own service of God. So this is not just meant to be a story to say, okay, there's a godly person whose name was Elisha, he lived many, many years ago. This is something that we are meant to apply to ourselves. And this is true of absolutely every single story in the Torah. They are not just stories representing something historical, which is true, and that's a conversation for a different time. But the fact is, the word Torah comes from the word hora'ah, which means a lesson. So we are meant to assess the story, break it down, and find some kind of application to ourselves and see how we can learn that lesson to ourselves. So you can do that on so many different levels. You can do that on a historical level. You can do that from a leadership perspective. You can do it, of course, the moral and ethical imperatives. But now we're going to look at it from the spiritual perspective, how, again, the same way we did before, but how it applies to ourselves. So the Rebbe continues, and he says, the Alter Rebbe explains the story as follows. And all of the bold text go back to the original storyline. The woman refers to every Jew who is metaphorically God's wife. After all, that is the subject of the entire book of Shir Hashirim. Shir Hashirim, of course, is Song of Songs. And on a very simplistic level, it looks like a love poem. But when you get into it, it's very, very strangely phrased. You have a lot of changing back and forth between the male and the female within one verse. You have going back and forth between the plural and the singular. You have different loves, the love between a wife and a husband. You also have your sister. You'll have sometimes in my one verse, my sister, my bride. You have, so it was not written actually as a standard love poem. It is something far deeper. And the Talmud recounts that Rabbi Akiva was reading it, and actually the sages at one point wanted to ban it because they were afraid that people would read it too literally. And Rabbi Akiva was reading it, and they saw him crying, and they asked him crying, why he's crying, and he said, all of the Torah is holy, but Shir Hashirim is holy of holies. And so it's very, very, very emblematic of the more subtle elements of Judaism in terms of this relationship between us and God, which is this love story between us and between like a husband and wife. It's a love story between the Jewish people and God. So she, the soul, is also referred to as the wife of one of the disciples of the prophets. Why is that? It explains because prophecy is defined by receiving God's messages. And this is an idea that is relevant to every single Jew. This is an important idea because oftentimes people think to themselves, God doesn't speak to us. He only spoke to the prophets or whatever it is. You'll hear that, in my time dealing with college students and high school students, that was a common question that people had. But the truth of the matter is that God speaks to us as well. And the question is whether we are picking up those messages, whether we're paying attention to the things happening to ourselves, around ourselves, whether we have antennae, so to speak, up to receive those messages. That's a subtle element of life, but it's very, very much part of life. And God doesn't speak in lightning and thunder. God speaks, as he tells Elijah himself, in the silence. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to consider that. The Torah gives us the parameters through which we can understand what the messages would be. But the fact of the matter is that every Jew is capable of understanding that I'm receiving a message from God. So the soul cries out. She cries out to Elisha. Elisha, we explained before, means Keli Shah, my God, please pay attention to me. Here, he says, the word Elisha comes from the word Yeshua, which means salvation. And so therefore, he says, my God of salvation. Slight change in terms of the nuances, but basically the same idea. And she says, God, I know you are my salvation, but the fact of the matter is your servant, my husband, is dead. My husband in Hebrew is Ishi, which itself is made up of the word Ish, fire, and the word letter Yud, which symbolizes the level of Chachma in the soul and refers to the deepest essence of the soul. So the reason why the letter Yud represents Chachma is because Chachma is the first stage in the intellectual process. And that first stage is the kernel of the idea. It doesn't have breadth, it doesn't have width, it's just the spark of an idea. And the Yud, likewise, has no real breadth or width. It's just basically, it's just a point. It's just a dot. There's really not much to it. And especially in comparison with any of the other letters, it has not very much space. And so that's the reason why Yud represents Chachma. And Chachma of the soul, of course, is the kernel of the entire process of developing. It's the very, very, very tip of experience, the entire experience. And it's the very most relatable element of ourselves. There are deeper elements of ourselves, but we don't want to get into that. But right now, it's Chachma we're referring to as the deepest part of our subconscious self. She is therefore crying out, my soul, which used to be attached to God with fiery love, has lost that capacity for some reason. And therefore, because I no longer have this passionate connection with God, therefore, a creditor is coming to seize my two children as slaves. In other words, the love and awe of God that I used to be able to generate as a result of intellectual contemplation are being taken captive by the evil inclination to be driven instead towards worldly and mundane matters, and even worse, things that oppose holiness. So again, going into our systems, the way we're supposed to be driven is from the mind into our emotion. So we have an idea. The idea is meant to drive what we do. Animals, of course, work the other way around, that they want something, and so therefore they will find a process to be able to get to it. It's one of the fascinating things when scientists try to assess intelligence of animals, they always do it in the parameters of receiving a reward. And the interesting thing is that even though they try to say, okay, human beings are really the same thing, from a Chassidic perspective, we actually see it's the exact opposite. Animals are focused on what they receive from it, so their emotional or the word, come on, their tendencies drive them through some kind of intellectual process to receive the end result. On the other hand, we may desire something, but we can have the ability to have our minds to control what it is and either say yes or no or whatever it is. So we might, of course, desire some food. Food's not kosher. We really, really want it. But we have the ability to be able to say, okay, that food's not kosher, and so therefore I'm not going to eat it. Or on a much higher level, it's the idea that the mind recognizes something as truth, and so therefore it pushes itself into it. I might not be hungry, but right now it's Shabbat. And so therefore I'm going to make Kiddush and I'm going to have a meal despite the fact that right now I'm not hungry. I don't particularly care for food. It's not about the food. It's about something else. So the intellect drives the rest of the things. But on a deeper level, it's more than just that. Prayer is meant to be a system in which we take ideas, which are intellectual, and we drive them through our emotion to be able to feel those concepts. And that's meant to drive us into a place where we walk out after prayer and we're capable of doing the right thing over the day. So we're meant to have a certain amount of mental contemplation about God, about God's existence, about God's relevance, about my appreciation for God, about the fact that God cares about me and is concerned about me and my place in the world every single day. And those thoughts are meant to drive the feelings. And we discussed this before when we discussed the whole idea of Lo Tiyeh Meshakela V'Akara B'Artzecha. So now he's saying that basically I used to have love and awe of God before I even came into a body, so is what we described it as before. But here he's saying it's actually such a person who used to be able to do it themselves. They were inspired at some point. They were able to take their prayer and to be able to generate feelings as a result of it. But now those feelings are not only not there, but they're being captive. They're being taken captive. The passion that I have for God is no longer a passion for God. Now it's passion for the Red Sox or for whoever else, sports or, whatever it is, money or, women or whatever. So some of those things could be things that are not particularly evil, but not particularly spiritual. And some of those things could be very much evil. And that's what the soul is crying out to God. What do I do? So back to the text. Elisha, God then says to her, every Jew has a home. And in your home, you certainly have something. What do you have in your home? And this is where the Rebbe adds this beautiful, beautiful idea. And just subtly, every Jew has a home. You have a place. You have a space where you are truly you. When we're running around all over the place, we don't recognize that there's a space which is where I am most me. That is my home. And here the Rebbe is making this subtle concept. He's saying every Jew has a home. And your home absolutely has the capacity to be able to connect. You need to come back to your home. You need to search in your home to be able to see what you have. And from that, you'll be able to see your personal connection to Judaism. So it's an unbelievably subtle concept that, again, we find in the Rebbe's treatment of the Alter Rebbe's treatment of the story. So he continues and says, what do you have in your home? So the soul replies, your maidservant does nothing at all in the house except a jug of oil. And the Rebbe points out just a tiny vessel with a minute amount of oil. There's nothing in my home. I've got almost no connection. There's just a tiny jug. There's just a minute amount of oil. But the answer is that you definitely have a connection. And that's what Elisha is telling her. Go back home, find what you have. And the Rebbe continues and said, this oil is the Jewish spark, the chachma of the soul. So God tells her, go and borrow empty vessels. Don't limit yourself. Even though the vessels are empty, as you stated before, that your husband is dead, still fill those empty vessels with that drop of oil, with your Jewish spark. Knowing that you're at home, knowing that you do have this connection, knowing that as a Jew, this is what you're meant to do, and this is my connection to God, even if I don't feel it, that is going to be able to propel something. And then the Rebbe goes to something else. That was similar to what we spoke about before. And then the Rebbe says the empty vessels means that you should consider your incredible descent. As long as the vessels are empty with your humility and self-awareness, there will still be oil from the Jewish spark until the jugs are full. And as soon as the jugs are full, the oil stops. And now you and your children will live on the remnant. So saying, as soon as a person, and this is very similar to what we spoke about in terms of the entire concept of Lo Tiyeh Meshakela, and that a person needs to recognize that they need to be empty in order to be able to receive. Very similar concept. But what that means is that basically, as long as a person is running after other things, the person cannot receive. But when a person recognizes in their humility that they are empty, it brings them the capability of being able to receive. And that means that a person needs to think about two contrasting ideas. On the one hand, we consider our descent, the descent of the soul into the body, the descent of our spiritual descent, wherever we are spiritually. that can be depressing if you only consider it by itself. But when you consider the descent along with the concept of the Jewish spark, that I might be on a very low level, but God is constantly with me. And despite my flaws, despite my inadequacies, despite anything that I might have done or anything of the sort, the fact of the matter is that I have this internal connection, and I will always have this internal connection. That combination is a very, very special combination. It needs to be both of those things together. The empty vessels by themselves aren't going to do anything. They're empty vessels. They need to be filled with the Jewish spark. The fact that you are a Jew, the fact that you have this connection to God, which is essential on the essence level and intimate no matter what the circumstances are. And so because of your humility, you're capable of receiving. You don't say that I'm great, and so therefore God chose me. You say, I'm not great. I've done all these things. I've failed in all these ways, and still God loves me. And that feeling of acceptance by God is something that is a very, very, very lofty, lofty feeling. It's a very powerful feeling. And that's what the Rebbe continues and says, the remnant refers to the level of soviv, which the soul will then be able to draw into her own personal service of God until, as the sages say, the dead are revived. The sages actually quote on this whole thing that you'll be able to live banotar on the extras, and the sages continue to say until the dead are revived, and that apparently this family on a simplistic level, I actually have to look it up, on a simplistic level, that they would always be able to live off of of this continuing blessing. But here we're talking about the spiritual dead being revived. Here we're talking about something very powerful. So what is soviv? We have 5 more minutes. We're going to discuss both in this essay as well as in the next one 2 parameters through which God creates the world. One is memale. Memale means to fill or to permeate the world, and that's how God enlivens every detail. I have, of course, in front of me, I've got a plastic fork. This plastic fork exists because God wants it to exist. You cannot compare the existence of this plastic fork to this physical body. This physical body has the ability to live and to be able to do all sorts of things that are completely unlike this plastic fork, which is basically one use and then, spend several, 1,000 years trying to disintegrate. Memale, however, gives us both the capability of existing. And it's not just true with regards to differences in terms of life forms or that which is inanimate versus that which is alive, but even with regards to all spiritual levels. We have the 4 worlds, 4 dimensions of creation, and Atzilut is such that it's Etzel, it is close to, it is next to godliness, so to speak. And our world is Asiya, which means the world of action. And they're incomparable whatsoever when you talk about their spiritual realities. In Atzilut, all that exists is godliness. In our world, godliness is very, very, very much concealed. So Memale enlivens each one of those worlds in accordance with what it needs to receive. Sovev, on the other hand, is encompassing. It is transcendent. It's above. It's aloof. It's beyond. And Sovev is an energy which creates everything in one mass, so to speak. It's God as God is transcendent beyond, and as the world really doesn't exist in its minutiae, in its details. But here we're saying something very, very interesting. We're saying that when a person takes into account this idea, they will be able to draw the element of the transcendence into their own world. And the Rebbe is going to ask the question, how is that possible? The transcendent is so beyond. How can we possibly make it practical? How can we possibly draw it downwards? And that's an important subject we're going to discuss, both, like I said, this essay as well as in the next one, as well as in future essays. It's a very, very, very critical idea. But just to finish this chapter quickly, the directive to every person is clear. Even when a person finds themselves in a descent relative to their previous spiritual station, he should not be crestfallen. On the contrary, and this is the Rebbe's continuation. At this point, until now, was the Rebbe's assessment of the Alter Rebbe's interpretation of the story. At this point is all the Rebbe's interpretation. So even when a person finds themselves on a lower spiritual place, they should never be crestfallen. On the contrary, the descent was the purpose of the growth that comes out of it. So we need to recognize that the vessels were emptied for a purpose. The Mitzvah Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe, explains this idea with the verse, a righteous man falls 7 times and then arises. And he explains that even someone who is on the level of a completely righteous person can fall, comparative, of course, with his own spiritual stature. But the intent behind the spiritual collapse is for the arising that happens afterwards, which will be on a much higher and deeper level, to the extent that there will be 7 ascents, each a quantum leap from the previous one. But rising to those incredible levels and becoming capable of receiving spiritual vitality, even from Sovev, means that one must go through the process of my husband died, and then to put oneself through the mentality of teshuvah, expressed in the empty vessels, the recognition of one's descent. So that is a powerful reflection on our lack of inspiration. Not to look at it as a failure, but to look at it as a new process, part of the natural process of decomposition, so to speak, and then afterwards regrowth, through which we must go in order to be able to get much, much higher levels. If we continue to go on just one level to the next in a natural way, we're never going to be able to hit true heights. But if we recognize that every so often we need to go through this process, and we recognize that this process is for the purpose of quantum growth, then the entire process itself becomes completely different. So we will explore that more, God willing,